Welcome back, everyone, as I have now returned from a trip to the Western Front with some of my friends. We went to Ypres, I went to Vimy Ridge, I went to the Somme, and we shot a lot of great content, and I'm excited for you to see it, not only on my channel, The Stories of the Great War, but also on their channels as well. My friend Sander from Sander VK History has already posted his first vlog from our trip, and it visits a couple of the sites, but also shows you a little bit of the behind the scenes of us, like doing things like going to the grocery store. So if you're into that sort of thing, I'll put the link down in the description. You can check out Sander VK History, my Dutch friend, and you can see a little bit of our trip to places like Hill 60 at Ypres. So I want to give a shout out and a thank you to, he lists himself as Paladin Macias or Macias Jonathan from San Antonio, Texas. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. Today we're going to be taking a look at, it's a shorter video, and it's a channel we haven't looked at before. The channel is called The Paint Explorer, and this video is every war strategy explained in 8 minutes. So I'm going to pull it up here on the screen so you can see, because right off the bat he kind of shows the shows what it is that we're looking at, and I think I have a pretty good handle on most of these, but there are definitely a few that I'm not real familiar with, or at least I don't have a deep understanding of. So we'll go through these, and we'll stop at different times. We'll talk about some of the history and some of the examples of when these have been used. I invite you to add your thoughts below. If one of these is something that is in an area that you know a lot about, please add to the conversation so we can all learn together in the comment section below. The link is in the description to the original content if you want to check them out and more of their content. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Sniper trap. The sniper intentionally shoots to wound instead of killing an enemy combatant, with the end goal of drawing more enemy units into the field of fire so the sniper can fire on them as they provide aid.
So there are examples of things like this happening. First one that comes to my mind is I know that in many cases the Japanese army would do this. They would actually target medics who are supposed to be considered non-combatants and shouldn't be shot at. There are obviously examples in every army where people take matters into their own hands and they violate these things. But there are also examples where armies, or individuals I should say, have intentionally pretended to be acting as a medic. A great example that comes to mind is the famous story of the INR platoon who makes a stand during the Battle of the Bulge. Every one of them are killed or captured, but they're probably the most highly decorated platoon in all of World War II. And at one point, a couple of Germans crawled out kind of into the area in between the lines and were acting as medics, but the men in the INR platoon figured out that they were really just trying to scout out the position, so they ended up shooting them. So, but there's also lots of examples of where just wounding a soldier, whether it's by a sniper or not, has been used effectively because it causes your enemy, instead of, if you kill the guy, it's one guy. If you wound somebody, now you've impacted many people because several guys are going to take care of that guy. So it's a way of knocking several guys out of the fight, at least for a short time.
Salvo. This technique's goal is to surprise the enemy and defeat him as quickly as possible to avoid his response. It's done by shooting the first shot with every cannon at the same time, and it's particularly good in water combat between ships because it also helps with setting the firing range, since multiple splashes are more visible than a single one. It was mostly practiced during World War I and World War II, since cruise missiles are now more commonly used. Hold down.
So we also sometimes have to understand that depending on the type of ship, they couldn't fire all their guns at once because it would be too much kind of pushing against one side, and so you might have to fire them in succession, like boom, 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 kind of go right down the line, and you see this portrayed a lot in movies.
One position. The tank would have to get on the back slope of a hill or use covers to expose as little of it as possible. This would make it possible for the barrel to be the only part visible to the enemy. It is still used in modern times, but it does have some cons. This technique is not fit for every terrain type, especially plains. The tanks have to have a great enough negative elevation, and they have to remain in the same position to not expose themselves.
You also have to worry about, exactly this, exposing that soft underbelly there. And the Russians took this to another extreme in certain battles on the Eastern Front in World War II, where they actually buried the tanks to where only the top of the tank, the turret, was above ground.
If the tank wants to go from defense to attack, it'd have a bad position as it would be looking upwards and exposing its underpart, which is usually the most vulnerable part. Creeping barrage. This technique consists in a gradual advance of artillery fire in order to provide cover for the infantry pushing forward towards the enemy trenches. It's better than using artillery directly on trenches, since most of the time they were resistant to it, defenders could easily be replaced, and barbed wires were left unharmed. However, it's pretty dangerous, as it needs coordination between infantry and artillery to avoid explosions too close to the infantry. Blitz.
The creeping barrage started before World War I. It was used in a few instances, but it was perfected in World War I. And it's really by about 1917 that they really get this down. At places like Vimy Ridge, if you look at the Allies there, if you look at the map, they have this creeping barrage out to 20, 30 lines of creeping barrage, and every so many minutes it would advance. And the idea was that your infantry advanced right behind it. You had to be close enough to where you were almost getting hit yourself, because the idea was that just as the barrage moved past the enemy front line, you were there already. And so he's ducked down. It's the same concept that's used in World War II, where you're setting out a base of fire to try and make the enemy keep his head down while you get around him. And this was used before World War II. There's examples of this in the Civil War that I can think of. But the whole idea there is to protect your advancing infantry, and it was all coordinated down to the second. This is why you have to have your watches exactly synced. And sometimes they would wear mirrors on the back. Every so many soldiers would wear a mirror so the artillery spotters could see where they were. And if they got behind and they weren't advancing far enough, or it took them too long to take a trench, then they fall behind that creeping barrage while it loses its effectiveness.
Krieg. This technique was famously used by the Germans during World War II, and it consists of a rapid, overwhelming, and dense force concentration in an arrow shape, with mechanized and motorized infantry and armored at the top, with the intent of not attacking the actual front line, but breaking through it. They also used artillery and close air support. One of the biggest pros of this technique is that it unbalances the enemy by continuously changing front lines. Foxhole.
So, first of all, Germans didn't really use the term blitzkrieg, although that was certainly a concept. And it's not something that first happened with tanks. It happened for a long time before that. World War I, the stormtrooper concept that the Germans used, where they would send a small force to kind of poke a hole in the line and then try to exploit that. American Civil War, you have Emory Upton's planned attack at Spotsylvania, where you, instead of attacking on a broad front, you have a very narrow front that you poke through, and hopefully you can exploit and drive a wedge into the lines. And it goes back long before that. So the idea of blitzkrieg is not new.
It's a hole where two infantry are positioned to cover and stay when enemies are too near, thanks to camouflage applied to the opening. This technique is said to have been originally created to combat blitzkrieg. There were some variations of this. For example, Germans had turrets on them, and the Japanese were better concealed thanks to the limited space, which permitted only one infantry unit to get into it, making it more effective for ambushes than cover. Recon by fire. Firing on likely enemy positions to see if they react, with the goal of confirming their position or absence. Single envelopment.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing really to add to either of those two. I think they're both pretty self-explanatory.
One decoy division attacks the front, while another one goes into the enemy's back from the sides and stops his reinforcements, communications, or shoots them from the back. Pincer movement.
That's kind of the main small unit tactic of the Second World War, right? Cover, lay down a base of fire, get around the enemy. You see that in Band of Brothers. You see Colonel Sink training them on that, and he has a map, and he's talking about the guys on the front kind of pinning them down. And this is why you would very often use a lot more ammunition than you were hitting people with, and we'll see numbers of the amount of information of ammunition that gets fired compared to the number of people that are hit. And you think, man, were they that terrible a shot? No, they weren't aiming. The guys in front were laying down a base of fire not to hit the enemy, but to pin him down, while someone else goes around and kills and captures him. Oh, I just skipped ahead.
Movement. When the enemy does a frontal assault, the central units remain in the center, while the two wings move outside and go into the enemy's side, making him fight the battle on two fronts and eventually encircling him.
So this happened a lot even back in Roman times. This is how Julius Caesar, with a smaller force, defeats Pompey Magnus. in kind of their big final showdown before Pompey flees to Egypt and is killed. He's able to overwhelm Pompey's cavalry and then get around. And this was the common tactic that was used during many of the Roman wars.
Oblique order. This is another flank tactic where one part of the army focuses on one side while the other slowly moves in an oblique way to break through the enemy line thanks to force concentration. Feigned retreat. Pretending to retreat to draw in the enemy in a vulnerable position. It frequently turns into a real retreat because undisciplined troops are likely to lose coherence and retreat for real.
And a lot of times we've seen throughout history where an actual or a feigned retreat, we don't always know. Right? Depending on the sources we have, we don't necessarily know if an enemy intentionally retreats or if an enemy just breaks. But a lot of times what we'll see is that it does have the effect of drawing them in. This is how Richard III lost the Battle of Bosworth. This is how William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings. Same thing. People pulling back and drawing the enemy in.
Inverted wedge. The weak center retreats slowly under the pressure of the enemies, while the wings push forward to try to encircle the enemy. Great responsibility is placed on the wings here. Crossing the T. A line of warships crosses in front of a line of enemy ships. This makes every horizontal warship able to shoot the vertical ships with every gun, while the vertical ships can only attack with their front guns.
Yeah, and that's something we see throughout naval history. You always talk about crossing the T. It's always about having more guns on your enemy than he can put on you. Just kind of common sense.
Overwatch. It's an alternating movement tactic that helps units go forward when they are under fire. This splits the team into two parts, one that provides overwatch and one that maneuvers.
So again, this is the same concept between single envelopment, except in this case, you're both moving forward from the front instead of trying to get around the flanks.
Moving part of the team gets to its destination. They stop and start using suppressive fire to cover the other part, which starts moving, and so on. Ambush. It's a surprise attack made by hidden units that wait for favorable positions or conditions to start attacking. Skirmishing.
Common sense.
Skirmishers are troops placed in front of the main body of units that stay in a very spread out line and harass the enemy by engaging in small and sporadic combat to delay their movement, disrupt their attack, or weaken their morale.
It also has the benefit of giving your main body then time to prepare and time to see what the enemy is doing. It's obviously very dangerous for the skirmisher if he's facing a large force, but it does buy you time if you're the defending force.
Trench raiding. Mainly used in World War I, it consisted of making small-scale nighttime surprise attacks on enemy trenches. They usually creeped up slowly on the sentries, guarding a small sector of the trench line, killed them as quietly as possible, and threw grenades into the dugouts where the enemies would sleep. This was also used to capture or disable high-value equipment, gather intelligence by seizing documents, etc. The returning raiders risked friendly fire, so they usually had a password system to identify themselves.
So a great example of a trench raid in World War I is Henry Johnson from the Harlem Hellfighters. He and Needham Roberts, who's the guy that was with him, they hear the Germans sneaking across on a trench raid, and there's a couple of dozen of them, and they have to fight them off pretty much single-handedly. This happened all the time throughout the war. A couple of reasons why. Number one is intelligence, as they mentioned, but also when you have months and months on the front line where nothing's happening, you're often just looking to do things to maybe give yourself an edge, keep the guys busy, make sure that they're doing things. It happens all throughout war. It was uniquely trench raiding in World War I because of the nature of the warfare, but there's always patrols. You know, you see in Band of Brothers, they send the patrol across the river to raid the German headquarters position and then leave a bomb behind. It's the same concept.
Swarming. This tactic is used to overwhelm a main target's defenses by attacking with multiple autonomous units. It's mainly used in asymmetric warfare, where one side has much less capacity or size, and it confuses the enemy thanks to irregular attacks, which usually happen from multiple positions. Flying.
Yeah, I get that. I guess I just never knew what it was called, but yeah, we absolutely do see that a lot.
Wedge. It's a body of units that moves forward in a triangular formation. It was more commonly used in ancient times.
That's a very common tactic in ancient times,
when melee combat was the main focus, but it's still used now thanks to the great situational awareness and visibility it provides. It's also often used by police riot squads. Defeat in detail. It's most useful against a more numerous enemy, and
Napoleon was brilliant at defeat in detail.
consists of dividing your force into smaller parts, which makes the enemy divide his forces as well, and then bringing a large portion of your force to fight against small enemy units in sequence, rather than in one large combat against the bulk of the enemy's divisions all at once.
You see, so often Napoleon Bonaparte was facing coalitions or just facing armies that were, if combined, way stronger than he was. And so he used this all the time with his corps spread out and then being able to rapidly concentrate and defeat and destroy an enemy. He tried to do this with Waterloo, but the Prussians were able to get back and into the fight before he was ready to fight them off.
Air interdiction. Bombing strategic points, which don't pose an immediate threat but change the course of the war. A distinction must be made between tactical and strategic air interdiction. Tactical air interdiction is meant to affect events rapidly or immediately, for example, by bombing supplies en route to the active battle area. Strategic air interdiction focuses on longer-term benefits and usually targets bridges, streets, etc.
You see this a lot in more modern times. You see this often as the first thing that is done. As you go in, take out the enemy's command and control, you take out his bridges, you take out his supplies, you take all the things that long-term would support his war effort, and then you go after the enemy frontline troops.
This is different from strategic bombing, which is unrelated to ground operations. Siege. Surrounding an enemy city or fortress in order to block its supplies and escaping enemy troops with the goal of forcing them to surrender because of low supplies or attacking them with a well-prepared assault. When the soldiers build a line of fortifications around a besieged city, it's called a contravallation. When they build a second line of fortifications facing away from the enemy's fort to protect themselves from the fort's allies, it's called a circumvallation. Mouse-holing. Open streets are very risky for infantry units since they sometimes don't provide sufficient cover, so they blast through walls to get into nearby rooms or buildings. Air assault.
Interesting. So again, I think that's another one that I think we're familiar with, but I guess I didn't know what the title or what it was called.
Using aircraft, such as helicopters, to get infantry behind the enemy lines and attack them from behind. It's the new vertical version of the other envelopment tactics. Tank descent. It consists of infantry units sitting on top of a tank and dismounting to fight on foot only in the final phase of the assault. They don't just use the tank as a transportation method, they protect it against anti-tank weapons.
Since the very beginning, I was actually just a couple days ago at Flers-Courcelette, which is the place on the Somme battlefield where tanks were used for the first time. And what they figured out pretty quickly, even with the early tanks, is that tanks were kind of useless without infantry support. So you had to learn how to use them in concert to one another. So that's still the case today.
Shoot and scoot. It's the artillery tactic of shooting at a target and immediately moving from the firing position to avoid counterattacks.
Kind of the same concept with snipers. You don't sit forever in one sniper position and risk the enemy figuring out where you are.
Marching fire. It's a form of suppressive fire where a group of walking infantry units keep firing to make the enemy hide behind cover, often with the final goal of getting closer to him and engaging in close combat.
Again, this is very similar in concept to single envelopment and other such suppressive fires, but in this case, it's almost like a frontal assault that uses suppressive fire. It's dangerous.
Center peel. It's a retreat technique used in modern-day infantry, often when small groups of infantry need to get away from a bigger enemy force. It's kind of similar to the bounding Overwatch technique, defense in depth. This strategy seeks to delay rather than prevent the advance of an attacker, relying on the tendency of an attack to lose momentum over a period of time or as it covers a larger area. Once the attacker is forced to spread out to cover a larger area, the defenders can counterattack, having to fight against smaller separated units.
So Germans did this a lot in World War I. You hear a lot about the Hindenburg Line. And what they would start to do is they would have a frontline position that was not their main line of resistance, but rather was the front line. And it would be less populated with soldiers, but what it would do is it would allow time to slow down the enemy, figure out what he's doing, and then you have your support and reserve trenches to where you can then counterattack once you have broken up the enemy a little bit. So the defense in depth system, Germans were great at that. They weren't the only ones who used it, but they did use it a lot.
Scorched earth. It involves retreating and destroying anything that the enemy might need, like food sources and transportation. It was famously used by Russia against Germany in the Second World War.
It's also famously used by Russia against Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars.
by the size of Russian territory and the freezing cold winter.
Exact same concept.
Shout out to these guys who...
So that was cool. It was quick, it was to the point, and it provided a lot of information. Like I said, let me know what you think and add to the conversation. And while I'm thinking about it, just a reminder, check out Sanders' video from the first part of our trip to Europe, and be watching on Stories of the Great War. The links for both are in the description. I just put up a video yesterday from Stories, or day before yesterday, from Stories of the Great War. And there'll be a whole lot more of that coming. Thank you, Hugh in Cypress, Texas, and Meg in Northfield, Massachusetts. Thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.